Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. We're just giving we just gave a few seconds for folks to start, but we want to go ahead and get started on the webinar for today. Thanks for taking time out of your day and joining us. I'm Jack Micah. I'm a vice president at Indegene in the PRMA group. And what we're going to spend a little bit of time today on is talking about recent and soon to be future developments in the market access landscape, especially related to IRA and copay strategies. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. The session is being recorded, so just wanted to let you know that. And you're also going to stay on mute. That's the way this thing has been set up. So please, we encourage you to put any thoughts or questions that you have in the Q&A box, and we will either take them as we go and or at the end of each mini part of this session. I mean, I know from the list of attendees it's kind of a mix of folks who we've known for a long time and folks who are new to us. So thank you for making the time to do this. I'm like I said, I'm a VP here. Have been a consultant in the market access pricing and reimbursement space now for a little more than 22 years. Both at Indegene since we were acquired about a little over 2 years ago, and at Medical Market Economics prior to that, for in one form or another for about 20 years. And what we're doing today is building on some work that we've been doing in following the potential for and then the actual passage of and beginnings of implementation of IRA, what became the IRA last summer, dealing with both kind of the intended and unintended consequences of that legislation. We have published a series of updates, and the we in that case is mostly relies on Matt Skoronsky, who you'll be hearing from a lot today, with a bit of help from myself and from Bill. And that I think we're up to, I don't know, 5 or 6 different posts in that we've done over time, and this kind of fits with that as a live session to be able to say, especially pre JP Morgan, hey, what's happening now? How do we bring folks up to date pretty quickly, and what kind of expectations we should have in thinking about moving forward into 2024. And a bit about that, especially in the context of it being an election year, which could change all of it or could change very little of it. But there are parts that have already been implemented, obviously, that probably are less likely to go away. I'll leave the introduction at that, and I'll turn it over to you two guys to introduce yourselves, and then we can roll right into things as opposed to me prattling on. So, Bill, you want to go next?
Hey, everybody. I'm Bill Loeb, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives here at Indegene, former founding partner for Medical Market Economics with Jack. Pharmacist by training, as well as holding a PhD in the pharmaceutical sciences. I started and now co-manage our market research arm, which is actually one of the things that led to me being included in this talk about copay accumulators. We did a specific piece of research that I'll give you some of the results of that with our payer panel. And I also sit in our ex-US working group. So I've been doing this also for 22 years. Happy to be here.
And I'm Matt Skoronsky. I'm a senior director in the pricing reimbursement market access HEOR arm of Indegene. And like Bill and Jack, I was prior to this, I was at MME for 15 years. And before that, I was at Bayer Pharmaceuticals. I'll do the play-by-play on the first portion of this. And the first portion of this webinar is the Inflation Reduction Act, as Jack had said. So what is the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA for short? As Jack said, it was passed in the summer of 2022, passed by Congress, signed into law by President Biden. The main goal of the IRA was not healthcare. It was primarily to fight inflation. There was high inflation at that period of time. It was also meant to invest in domestic energy production as well as reduce carbon emissions in the US. However, as we all know, it has some significant healthcare reform legislations that have turned us on our ears. And those three are the three on the right-hand side. The first one is an inflation penalty, and that's an inflation penalty for any drug that increases its price faster than the rate of inflation. Some of the rates of inflation were backdated to January 2021, so this has already started. The second healthcare provision is a cap on out-of-pocket and benefit design changes. Again, this deals primarily with Medicare. The standard benefit design of 4 phases is changing to 3 phases in 2025, along with a $2,000 out-of-pocket cap. And the third one, and the one that probably gets the most press, and the one that we're going to talk a little bit more about today, is the Medicare negotiated prices. As we said, its implementation has already started. Inflation penalties are taking place, and those get announced every quarter with the Part B drugs. And these changes extend over a period of time going out to 2030. But as alluded to earlier, there's still things that need to be worked out, ironed out, and rolled out. For example, just last Thursday, the inflation penalty, there was revised guidance mainly to provide additional process details and calculation details, a little bit to do with drugs in shortage or supply disruptions, as well as discarded drugs or wastage rebates on the Part B drugs. But as nuances happen, we'll be sure to fill you in on those as well. And then the last thing is this little thing called the 2024 presidential election that, as Jack said earlier, could do a lot. It could do a little to all these changes in the IRA. So the first thing that's happened recently is these 10 drugs got announced as drugs that the government has said they want to negotiate, first time negotiating. And they range from a few different manufacturers, Eliquis, Jardiance, Xarelto, Januvia, and the like. These drugs in total account for $50 billion in Medicare spend, the gross spend, or 20% of that spend in the 12 months ending May 2023. So these are some pretty big players when it comes to Medicare gross drug spend, not net drug spend. We're going to talk a little bit about that as well. And then the second thing that we noticed as these 10 drugs got announced is that certainly these drugs aren't just small drugs that treat small patient populations. Some of the drugs treat a pretty large number of Medicare Part D enrollees, and those numbers are on the right-hand side of this slide. So CMS did a couple interesting things here. They announced the 10 drugs. These 10 drugs were a little different than some of us pundits were thinking they might be, but they also focused in on a patient population and maybe prioritize that a little bit over drug spend with the inclusion of some of these drugs. The last thing on this slide that we wanted to point out is Stelara. So Stelara is a drug from Janssen that treats a few different conditions, but Stelara is potentially going off of this list. That's because on November 7th, Stelara, the CMS noted that it was possibly going to get deselected because the FDA approved a drug, an interchangeable biosimilar called Wezlana from Amgen. And the guidelines in the Medicare negotiation says if a drug is subject to meaningful competition, and certainly in Stelara's case, a biosimilar, interchangeable biosimilar could meet that definition of meaningful competition, which means Stelara may come off this drug and get off this drug list and get replaced by another drug.
And Matt, if I can take you back just a little bit, the phenomenon that Matt mentioned about the drugs that were picked on the list and what people anticipated might be on the list and the drugs that were actually put on the list, the little bit of disconnect there that he discussed around the total cumulative sales, which is a big number, $50 billion. I'll take it. I'd even be willing to defer all but $2 billion a year in following on in Shohei Ohtani's path. But the number of patients being different, they didn't actually pick the highest spend drugs in every category, and the thought is that they picked some of the drugs that touch more patients, because while the stated goal is to reduce overall Medicare costs, it's a question of how many patients get touched by the reduction of those costs. The more patients that get touched by the reduction, then potentially the more happy voters there are to give their approval to that in the future. So it's one of those things where you kind of look at it and say, well, why would they make a decision like that? And when you start to think about it a little bit, it starts to come through. You see that a lot in these kind of situations. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to circle back to that, Matt.
Nope, that's great, Jack. Thanks.
Yeah.
And that's exactly Jack's first point, is exactly the point on the slide, is that they prioritize the patient impact. And there were some surprises. All right. Xtandi, which is number 12, if we were ranking these in CMS drug spend, Xtandi was the 12th most expensive drug from a drug spend perspective. Mevetrix was 17 and Ibrance was 18. And these drugs were not subject to negotiation, at least in the first round for 2025. So we were some of the pundits like us were a little surprised that they were excluded. And we're a little surprised that some of these other drugs, like Entresto, which was number 23 on spend, Stelara, and Farxiga, came in as included in the drug negotiations. So to that point of potentially prioritizing patient impact over cost impact kind of shines through. The next thing on the list is that some of these drugs may only be on this negotiation list for a year or two. We've already mentioned Stelara. So if Stelara remains on the list to get negotiated for 2025, we expect that to be only for a year. Similarly, Entresto, Xarelto, and Januvia all are on the drug negotiation list, and they have generics potentially early or next year. So again, if these drugs get selected for negotiations, they may only be on for a small amount of time. And Enbrel is on the list. That's a special case that they have an agreement to delay the launch of that generic until 2029. So that will be on the list for a couple of years. So now that we know the 10 drugs that are on the list, there's certainly a lot of situations for drugs that compete with the drugs that are on the list. And that's what we're calling included by negotiations by association. So there's a lot of diabetes drugs on the top 10 list. And there's a lot of diabetes drugs that compete with those drugs that are on the top 10 list. And certainly two of them that come to mind really quickly are Ozempic and Trulicity. Well, these drugs, I'm sure if they haven't already, they're in the process of putting through all their 2025 Medicare Part D bids for 2025, as that bid cycle is active and in place right now. So they're have to decide, hey, well, what kind of discount do I want to provide on the Medicare bids to compete with drugs that are going to get selected for negotiations, not knowing what the language is going to be for those drugs that are negotiated and how they're treated from a formulary and utilization management standpoint. Similarly, a drug like Rinvoq, who competes with not only Enbrel, who's on the list, but it also competes with Humira, Cimzia, Simponi, and Remicade. They have to decide how they're going to approach the 2025 bid cycle. So the 2025 bid cycle is going to get really interesting, and manufacturers have to think about these things, and have probably already thought about these things on how they're going to bid. Anything to add, Jack?
Nope, I think you got it.
So the interesting thing, and the posturing from the manufacturers, and certainly understandable, was whether or not they even wanted to negotiate. All 10 of the manufacturers that have the drugs that are on the list agreed to negotiate, and negotiate is in parentheses because certainly it didn't feel like a negotiation for these manufacturers. It certainly felt like something that was probably forced upon them, and so most of them, in fact, all of them sued. They sued, and we're expecting these lawsuits will proceed, and expect to see a stay at some point in the not too distant future with regards to this situation. In addition to these exact consequences, there's also unintended consequences.
Matt, before you go to the unintended, can I make a comment on the first part?
Absolutely.
So the whole deal around, hey, this isn't really a negotiation, has to do with the rather draconian things that get imposed upon a company who says, I'm not going to negotiate, right? So it basically says and that's part of what's being disputed in the lawsuits, is it basically says, if you don't negotiate, if we don't come to an agreement, you can't have any sales to the government. Period. Not just on that drug, any sales to the government at all. Which is a pretty big penalty for people to try to swallow. And that's why they say, well, I'm being asked to negotiate, but the penalty is such that I really have no choice. I have to negotiate. So they've all made the selection at this point to say, okay, I'll negotiate, but they've all basically said, I'm doing this under protest and I'm going to sue you, government, because you've put me in a position where there is no negotiation. It's an imposition of a price on me, which isn't the way that the world works here in the US. So that's very, very simplified take on how that's working.
Thank you,
Okay,
Jack.
Matt. Yeah.
Yep. So we've already talked a little bit about Ozempic and Trulicity and how they, the challenges that they have in approaching the 2025 bids. But what about these other weight loss drugs that are direct results of them as well? Wegovy and Zepbound. What should they do from a Part D standpoint? Do they do anything? Do they have to bid significantly? So the implications for not just the 10 drugs, but all these drugs that compete with them are certainly things that are going to be interesting to watch and observe, and to see how the market reacts.
And those decisions that they have to make on the bids for 2025, they have to make now. So they can't say, oh, let me wait and see what the election outcome is, or how this stuff gets rolled out, or how these lawsuits get resolved. They're making bids that lock them in for a little over a year from now, that they're going to have to live with. It's going to be pretty tough for it to go in another direction. So there's a lot of crystal balling that has to go into those kind of situations.
Absolutely. And the PDPs and the manufacturers during this 2025 bid cycle had a lot of questions that I'm sure is going to get answered in the early part of 2024, that we're going to keep an eye on as well, and the industry will keep an eye on. And the other language that was in the Inflation Reduction Act was a little blurb about premiums only increasing by 6% on the PDPs. So combined with some of the other IRA inflation penalty, as well as the benefit design changes, there's a lot more cost being pushed onto the manufacturers as well as the plans. So in looking at the whole book of business for a payer, we're expecting the commercial book to get some extra focus from the payers as well, in terms of looking for any kind of revenue sources from manufacturers there, as well as some of the things that Bill's going to lead in the second part of this discussion with copay accumulators. So what are we expecting? We're expecting a Stelara replacement announcement, probably with one of those 3 drugs that we thought might be included in the list that are not on the list. We know that this being the end of December and January 1st price increases right around the corner, we're going to stay in the news, because price increases are likely going to occur, and there's going to be a lot of political pressure on the announcements of some of those price increases. And then finally, as the Part D bids get announced on who won or lost formularies there, We're expecting some of the questions from the PDPs as well as some of the Part D announcements to get a little clearer in the next coming months.
And certainly the big one that's not on the slide is the election cycle is going to progress, but it's not going to be resolved within the next 6 months. So that's a whole nother thing that overhangs on this. That was designed. I mean, the whole implementation schedule was designed so that overhang would be there, with the long-term nature of a lot of these things from a rollout perspective. Not, everybody knew what the election cycle was at the beginning, and it was designed in such a way to say, hey, we'll pass this as long as we have a chance to change it before it actually happens in some significant ways, which is still certainly a possibility. I mean, hey, recently we've heard about efforts to let's go back and repeal the Affordable Care Act, which obviously people have been talking about for a long time since it passed. And then it kind of stopped, and now it's back again. And oh, maybe I asked for that because I'm going to do this instead. There's all kinds of interesting things from a political perspective that folks might decide to undertake.
I have one question that's been posted, and also ask it to you guys. Can you elaborate on the political implications associated with CMS's decision to prioritize treating a larger patient population rather than solely focus on drug costs?
You want to go, Matt?
Why don't you go on that, Jack? Since you were just talking about the political ramification, this ties nicely into that.
The thing about the political implications of that really are kind of, it's almost done behind the scenes, right? I don't think most people recognize the fact that, I thought there was a list that went from 1 to 10, and here's 1 through 5, and then a smattering of numbers that come after 10. Why is that? What's going on? It's not likely to be a political fight to say, hey, let's put this in there or that in there. Instead, let's go back to what it was supposed to be. It's the same from a manufacturer perspective. I mean, a manufacturer who got stuck in, who was further down the list, is not going to be happy about it, and it might be part of what they're gonna try to include in their litigation. Whereas the manufacturers who should have been on the list and probably aren't going to say a word about it. So it really has to do with trying to find a way to get traction around where you want to go and what you want to do. And there's the cynical part of me certainly thinks that part of it is that, for many, many years, all the discussion around folks wanting to reform biopharmaceutical pricing had to do with the fact that they could run on it in elections and get votes even if they didn't do anything. Now people are trying to do things and experimenting with them, so the details around how it works are going to be disputed, but some of them disputed more loudly than others. I don't know. Does that cover it, Matt?
Definitely did.
Okay, cool.
Any other questions from the group? Certainly, if you have questions about the IRA section or the section that's coming up, post them in and we will get to them at the end of this as best we can.
Yep.
So I'll speak for a few minutes on generalities and then specific research and changes as it relates to the copay accumulator and maximizer market space. So for grounding, if these are not terms that you've heard before, essentially the goal of these programs is to take manufacturers' patient out-of-pocket support programs and coupon programs and have them not count towards the patient's deductible or their maximum out-of-pocket costs. So essentially, it's lowering the plan spend, which lowers the plan sponsor spend, but shifts the cost to the patients and the manufacturers. So if the manufacturer wants to maintain the program, they have to increase the benefit because it's going to have to be year round and cover for those patients that are in those in plans that have copay accumulators or maximizers. And so it's a fact of the market that we all said, okay, is this a problem? What's it going to be? And there's been a lot of reports out there that said, oh, there's 30-40% of lives that have copay accumulators, and what does that actually mean? So we did a specific piece of research to dig into that further. and try and get into how the copay accumulators and maximizers are actually applied by plans. But the difference between the two is essentially the way it's counted. Accumulators are counted as they come, and maximizers are taken as the maximum benefit and then divided across the year. Otherwise, the goal of both of them is to take the manufacturer's offsets and have them not count towards patient out-of-pocket spend. Plain and simple. In our research, what we looked at was, okay, how many lives are actually exposed to the accumulator and maximizer points? Next slide, Matt. And literally in our study that had over 40 payers in it, we had 213 million commercial lives covered. Only 12.4% of those lives had an accumulator that could apply to all drugs. So it's not a place where it was as ubiquitous as has been reported by others. And how we got there was to say, how many lives do you have? How many lives do you have that have a copay accumulator within them? That was 65% of lives. So it took us to 138 million. And then how many lives within that does the copay accumulator actually apply to? So do you have an accumulator? Yes. How many lives does it apply to? 31%. And then how many of those lives does it apply to all of them? And that takes it to 12.4% of the total lives. So there's a number of things to factor in there. First off, that plans that say they have an accumulator, it's less than half of the plans that actually have an accumulator. And then do they apply it to all products? Accumulators are applied more easily to specialty products in which the plan actually controls or contracts with the specialty pharmacy provider, because then they can get the data more readily. So it's easier to apply it there. So it's not quite as broad as people had reported it before. And in fact, the plans themselves, and again, this is a study of payers, said that they were not planning to really significantly accumulate increases in their accumulator use, no pun intended. So 1.8% year over year was the expected growth of exposure. So not a main growth focus for them over time. And there's a number of reasons that lead into that. One of them is that there's significant groundswells at both the state and federal levels against these programs being implemented or maintained. So recently, a payer advocacy group for HIV hepatitis sued to stop the exposure to copay accumulator programs associated with brands that did not have a generic. And so if there was a massive amount of pocket that was being capped there by the payers, they've now actually struck it down and struck down a report in September of this year. So it's a place where now we see the courts actually saying, okay, these can't be applied. And in fact, HHS has said these can't be applied. So they've looked at maximizer programs, and for certain patient groups and for certain plans, they don't want them in place. So it's literally at the federal level, be it in the district courts or be it in the regulatory bodies, you see a swell of changes moving against these. And that actually mirrors something that's happening at the state level. We continue to see a growth in state level changes of laws banning accumulators. And so we're now up to 20 states that have laws that are there and are banning that. And it bans them from anything that keeps these programs from not counting towards the patient's deductible. So what happens in these patient populations is you can have a specialty drug, for example. We listed a bunch of them on the IRA slide, but if you look at the drugs that are intended for RA, all of them have these programs because they're expensive. Well, that patient maximum out-of-pocket cost is never met, so they don't get into the reduced pay situation because then manufacturers always have to pick it up. So it's a place where that's now been banned in 20 states. Well, why does this matter? Because in our study of the payers, literally 65% of the lives were in states that had, next slide, Matt. The next slide of next states that had copay accumulators that were forbidden. So it's a small portion of them that actually had copay accumulators, but it was a large portion of the lives. And in addition to that, there were a number of those plans that don't have accumulators at all. So what this means is that when you're administering a benefit, there's now multiple places where there can be missteps if you put accumulator in place. One of them is as it regards to which state you're providing the benefit in and how you minimize that. So we did not, in that 12.4%, for example, reduce the states and take proportionally states out of the study and say, okay, these states can't count out of those lives, but that would reduce that 12.4% significantly. So if plans are doing that and monitoring for that or not doing that is a key component moving forward. It could be an area that's an issue for the plans themselves. In addition, the plan sponsors, next slide, Matt. The plan sponsors are a place where, if you remember plan sponsors 10 years back asking for rebate transparency, there's probably a time sometimes in the future to look for accumulator transparency. They're not asking for that information now, but there appears to be a growth of them asking for it. About 28% of it asking for it in the RFPs from the plans themselves. 25% asking for information, but not asking for it to be included in the RFPs. And then a full third not asking for it at all. So it is a place where we see that as a potential for growing. If these programs continue to exist, we think plan sponsors requesting information about them could continue to exist and have them be included, similar to what rebate transparency did before. So there's multiple places where the benefits of these as control mechanisms and as maintenance mechanisms for plans may actually reduce both legislatively, regulatorily, legally, and with plan sponsors factoring in. So there's a number of things that we factor in and looking at. Are these programs going to continue, and how big can they become? And we think that we actually have probably hit a point where they're not going to get that much bigger and start receding some, and plans are going to look for something else to do with regards to these programs.
Bill, before you go to the summary, can I go back to a couple of slides? Just pointing on the HIV hepatitis policy institute on accumulators on the left-hand side there. Just want to point out that at the end of November, the Biden administration did do some unusual things with regard specifically here. They filed a motion to clarify, which basically, and also said that they will not enforce the court's ruling on this. So that was, quite interesting. The second thing they did here is they filed an appeal with the DC Circuit Court. So, again, there's there's still, a kind of a disconnect between what they want to do and what they say they're doing. So certainly within the IRA and the accumulators with regard to patient cost exposure.
So in summary, less than half had an accumulator program that applied to at least one drug and included their lives. And as I said before, only 12% of the lives had accumulator programs that could apply to all drugs, regardless of cost. And it wasn't expected to grow. A key point that I want to hit here is that payers who have not implemented it have not done so because they don't want the public relations issues, they don't want scrutiny, and they don't want it to be an operational barrier. And because states have made it illegal. So these are all things that are going to continue to mitigate the programmatic application of accumulators and maximizers. Another thing that we found astounding, but at least it was a nice moment of honesty from payers, is that 40% of the payers in the study strongly agreed that copay accumulator shift healthcare costs away from them and onto patients, right? So they recognize what they're doing, and that level of ambivalence is one of the things I think that's actually moving towards legislative action as well. And they've excluded it, and manufacturers have started to work to exclude the accumulators from their rebate contract. So if you're putting an accumulator on lives, we're going to put in our rebate contract, those lives are not counted for rebates. So they're playing the game the other way, with manufacturers being aggressive to try and stop that. And right now, it's a place where that could also change in the future. And as I said, and as Matt included to, there's continued legal and legislative action. We would expect more states in 24 to ban these programs, and we would expect more legislative action, more restrictions with regards to regulatory legal.
We have one question, guys, if you're ready for that. The question is, are there any potential drawbacks or concerns associated with not accounting for manufacturer cost offsets in patient financial calculations?
Well, I mean, if I'm reading this correctly, and you can correct me, Jack or Matt, if you're reading it differently, but the benefit to the patient is that it gets their deductible, their maximum out-of-pocket cost, and gets them to the using manufacturer support. And so the drawbacks about not accounting for it are that it immediately exposes patients to continued need. If the manufacturer program ends, then the patient's ability to afford ends. And so that's what we see in situations where we're having a 20% cost share on a $50,000 a year drug. You're talking about $10,000 a year spend, and the patient would be exposed to that at some point. So if it's not a place where it's counting towards their deductible, their out-of-pocket maximum being hit, then they're going to be exposed to it if the manufacturer does not continue that program. I don't know if I can think of any from the payer side, because that enables them to negate those dollars off and move it to a place where they're not going to have to pay additional. But from the patient side, that's the real negative impact of these programs. And that's why the HIV hepatitis groups sued against these programs.
Agreed.
Any other thoughts or questions? Sorry, you have to type them out as opposed to call them out. Another one, in what ways will the proposed CMS changes affect the calculation of annual cost sharing limits for certain prescription drugs?
I think that's an IRA question.
Yeah, I think that's Matt's.
So in what ways will the proposed CMS changes affect the calculation of annual cost sharing limits for certain prescription drugs? There's a cap that's coming, and that cap is then split across the months, right? It's not actually all up front.
Well, they could choose to spread the $2,000 across the year, or they could choose not to. I think that's the main thing on the annual cost sharing on the Medicare standard benefit design changes for 2025. 2024 has some additional things that are going on with the elimination of the catastrophic cost sharing. Patients out of pocket responsibility will max out at about $3,250 next year in 2024. So that'll be some of the other changes in terms of out of pocket for prescription drugs and Medicare for next year. So
yeah, and what we've seen in Part D over the years is that there's been a significant amount of walk away when patient burden and affordability increases. And there's thresholds to that, obviously, but what we think this does, especially with splitting in 25, the $2,000 over a 12-month time period, is literally makes it so that threshold is known up front and manageable, as opposed to the way that the patients have had to live since Medicare modernization brought about Part D, and move it into a place where they can understand that and budget for it. And that's been the risk in the game that have had been played by people that are participating within Part D and manage it, is to have their kids or themselves go to a website, which was always the great thing that started all the way back in 2007-8. Go to a website, try and figure out which one's the best plan for you with your current drugs, and then see what you're going to do next year, and have it always be a game. And so I think that's a place where that helps reduce some of those burdens of figuring that out. If your out of pocket is capped at $3,250, $3,300, and if your out of pocket is capped later at $2,000, it's less spend first and foremost, and then it's a divided spend, which really benefits patients.
Yeah, the less spend is the big thing. How it gets divvied up, then you can think about later. But it's the less is more.
Yeah, come on. If you think about, Jack, just speaking extemporaneously, if you think about, I've got $2,000 and it's divided by 12, right? So I have less than $200 a month in spend. I have, in this patient population, I also have my retirement benefit, my Social Security benefit, what other forms of income I have coming in. I can factor in less than $200 a month and figure out what I need to move around. What's always hit these patients, in particular January, February timeframe, is, oh my God, I have to pay $5,000 now. And that's all changed. With the total amount, you're right, and then by dividing it and having the copay be smooth, really make it a place where they can plan for it.
Right. Yep. Yep. Great. Okay. Anything else? Any parting comments, guys?
Thank you for the time today.
I appreciate it. Appreciate you coming in on the beginning of the holiday week where people start moving away and working less. We appreciate you being here. We will do one that's not right before Christmas, as our next one is already planned. So we'll give more notification around that. But happy holidays and happy new year to everybody. Thanks for joining.
And certainly, if you have any thoughts or questions or anything follow-up wise, we're available. All our emails are on the screen. We're happy to talk to you about this stuff anytime. We're geeks about it, so it's fun for us.
And
Thanks so much.
We'll continue to update you as things progress.
Yep.
Thanks a lot.
Happy holidays, everyone.